Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Sari and you are watching my knitting podcasts. This is the fourth episode of my mini-series, which I'm calling the Sweater Chronicles. And in this mini-series, I'm talking about knitwear design, especially knitting or designing sweaters. And I've been chronicling the design process of this new pullover design that is coming in mid-November, and the sweater is called Onnen, and I'm knitting it as part of the Fibre Company's indie designer knitwear program, which means that I got yarn support from the Fibre Company, and this sweater has been knitted with the Fibre Company Cumbria, and the colorway is called Yew Tree. In the first episode of this mini-series, I talked about making submissions for knitwear publications. The second episode was about making swatches. As you can see, this is a swatch for this sweater. And this is another swatch for another sweater that I've been talking about in this mini-series. The third episode was about grading. It had a lot of math in it, and today I'm talking more about writing patterns and what to do after you have your swatches and you have your a spreadsheet with numbers from grading. The first thing you have to consider when you are writing a pattern is the construction. Usually if you have made a submission, you have already written something about the construction in the submission, but not all knitwear designs are started with a submission. You might self-publish it, or it might be a commission, so you probably don't always make a submission. But when you start writing the pattern, the first thing you have to do is think about the construction of the design you are making. So are you knitting it flat or in a round? Or is it seamless, or are there seams, or is it like modular where you pick up stitches along the edges of the pieces as you go and join them together that way? Is there like provisional cast on, tubular cast on, long tail cast on? What kind of methods you are using? Are you knitting it top down or bottom up? How about the sleeves? This one has a raglan construction. The grey sweater I'm making will have a dropped shoulder construction, and in the previous episode I was talking about the knitting direction. So as it has dropped shoulders, I was thinking whether I will pick up stitches along the armhole or knit the sleeve separately. But that has to do with the knitting direction. So I was thinking about whether I will have only stockinette or reverse stockinette stitch for the sleeves, or adding cables. And as I decided to put cables on the sleeves, then I started to knit it from the cuff upwards, so that the knitting direction stays the same as I have knitted the cables from bottom upwards. So the construction is the first thing you have to think about, and usually I write the construction with a couple of words in the pattern at the beginning of the pattern, so also the knitter will know what she or he is doing and what order they are doing the things. So just a few rows, a brief description of the construction. So For example, for this sweater, I would write that it is knitted seamlessly from bottom up with a raglan construction, and the sleeves are joined at underarm, and lastly the neck is picked from the stitches for the neck are picked and knitted in a round, and then about the armholes there will be the armholes will be joined together with Kitchener stitch, so something like that. For this sweater I would write that or it's this way, it's a cabled pullover knitted flat in pieces and then seamed together, and it is also knitted from bottom up, and lastly the collar stitches, as for this one, are picked from the body and knitted in a round, so something like that, so that the knitter will know what they are doing. At the beginning of the pattern I usually write the essential info about that design, which means like which sizes we are having. So for example, for sweaters I will first write extra small, small, medium, large, and so on, and then from the spreadsheet, as we have written the bust sizes and the intended ease, also arm length, body length, and so on, everything that is essential for that design, so the knitter will know which size they should pick. And I have written these in my spreadsheet, so I will just copy the numbers from my spreadsheet to this pattern and write them out. Then what yarn the pattern requires, so usually I write the yarn that I have used to knit the sample, and also the yarn weight, and if somebody wants to substitute it for something else, what type of yarn they should be using and how much yarn they need for each size. For the Onnen sweater I was using the Fibre Co Cumbria, and here I will write what the fiber content is and what the yardage is, so how many yards or how many meters there are per one skein, so also if it's a 50-gram skein or a 100-gram skein, and then I will write how many meters you need if you're substituting the yarn for something else. So the Fibre Co Cumbria is 60% merino wool, 30% masham wool, and 10% mohair wool. I will write the amounts of the yardage after I have calculated. I will show you in a separate episode how to calculate yardage for different sizes. And then I will write the needle sizes and all the needle sizes that you need for the design, also the cable lengths. So the smaller needles you usually need for ribbing, and then if you have main section, usually larger needles for the main section, and if you have fair isle you have like even bigger needle size, then add that as well. And you need to specify the type of the needle, so if it's a circular needle or a double pointed needles. Then gauge, that is very important. Also how many stitches, how many rows or rounds per 10 centimeters or 4 inches if you want to use inches. In what needle size you use to get the gauge. in what pattern. Is it in stockinette stitch? Is it over the cables? For the cables, I usually mark roughly around which row or round I got that gauge from. Also, if the gauge is gotten from something that you have knitted in a round or flat, is it blocked or after or unblocked, so after blocking or pre-blocking. And usually I always write that use the needle size that you get the right gauge, so not the needle size that I have written on the pattern, but the needle size you need to get the gauge, because all of our knitting handwriting is a bit different. Some people, even though they have the same yarn and same needles, knit tighter. Some people knit more loosely, so it is very important to add that note there as well. And lastly, notions. If the knitter needs stitch markers, you can write how many stitch markers they need, or sewing needle or cable needle, waste yarn, stitch holder, and so on. If they need buttons, a zipper, stuff like that. Then in the pattern, I usually write the abbreviations and special techniques. Usually I put that in the end of the document, but you can put it at the beginning in or which way you like. I have seen some people doing it like that at the beginning, even though I usually put it at the end. So that means that if you have some special techniques, if you either you can write them yourself, or then I will add links where to find all the information you need for that, or links to YouTube or another online tutorials. The abbreviations, I usually fill the list as I write the pattern, so every time I come across a new shortening, like when I start to write cast on and I use CO for that, then I put that in the list, and in the end I will write all the explanations what the shortenings mean. And the next thing is to make kind of a skeleton of the pattern. So that is kind of like deconstructing the pattern into building blocks. So I write like rough topics. So if I'm knitting the sweater from top down, I would write like neck, then yoke, body, sleeves, and so on. But for example, for this one, as it's knitted from bottom up, I would start with like body, and then sleeves, yoke, and collar. Or for a hat, I would start with a brim, then the main part and crown. So just like this really rough, like a guideline for the pattern. And then I will start filling it up. So for example, the body, we start with hem. So there's first hem, then the main part. If there's waist shaping, I will add that, and then separating for underarm. As well as for the sleeves, there are first the cuffs, and then the main sleeve, and separating for underarm. Next thing is raglan, and starting to shape the raglan, and shaping the neck if there's like neck drop. For example, this sweater has a slight neck drop, which means that the neck is higher at the back than at the front. So the last few rows are knitted flat back and forth with short rows, or for this design, binding of stitches at each side of the neck. And lastly, the collar, so picking up the stitches and the collar. The next thing you have to think about is casting on, which cast on technique you want to use, whether it is long tail cast on, which is probably the most common and well known, or if you want to use something else, alternating cast on, cabled cast on, tubular cast on, or so on. Usually if I have unusual or not something else that long tail cast on, I usually write an alternative to cast on with the long tail method so that it doesn't scare off people. For example, for tubular cast on, you cast on at the beginning, you cast on a different amount of stitches than you would for the long tail cast on. So sorry. So if I'm writing a pattern that uses tubular cast on, I would first write like option 1, tubular cast on, and write the instructions for that part, or option 2, long tail cast on. So if you don't want to knit the tubular cast on, you can do this, and then like all versions resume, and how it continues for all sizes. When you write the cast on technique, you would also write there which needle size you need. So usually you have a smaller needle size for the ribbing and a bigger needle size for the main part. So you have to write which needle size you are using for that part. And the long tail or the cast on technique, how many stitches to cast on, and which yarn to use, whether you are using a waste yarn or the main yarn, or if you have more than one color for your design, then note which yarn to use, so the person who is casting on has all the information right from the beginning. You can check your spreadsheet, and there you can find how many stitches you should cast on. We calculated all that in the previous episode, so it's all there. Just pick up the stitch counts and write them out in your pattern. Then the next question is your design knitted flat or in the round? So after you have casted on the stitches, the next question is whether you should join in a round or a knot. So if you are joining in a round, you have to write that you are now joining it in a round. So probably they should place a marker for the beginning of the round, and note that they shouldn't twist the ring of stitches so that it is nice and even. Or if it's knitted flat, then you have to write that do not join in a round. If it is knitted flat, you have to remember to tell the knitter which one is the wrong side and which one is the right side. So at the beginning of each row, remember to write whether it is RS, so right side row, or WS, so wrong side row. If it's a long tail cast on, usually the first row is a wrong side row, because the long tail cast on is not identical on each side. So there's a slight variation to the cast on, and I will show you with this sock so you can see. This is the wrong side and this is the right side. And you can see, actually you can see them both here quite nicely at the same time. At the beginning of these knit rounds, there is this slight bump at the beginning of the stitch, and it doesn't happen here on the other side. So usually this side is considered as the wrong side of the design. So you might or you should be aware of that little thing. So if you have a long tail cast on and you are knitting it flat, please note that the first row is a setup row or row 1, and it should be a wrong side row. Usually people prefer knitting things in a round as it's often it's faster, it's easier. For example, for this design, this was knitted in a round, so you get to knit more and purl less. If this was knitted flat, then all these parts and the whole back, which doesn't have any cable patterns, would be knitted from the wrong side. So all the parts that are knitted would be purling, and usually people prefer knitting more than purling. If you have colorwork design, something like Fair Isle or stranded knitting, people usually prefer knitting colorwork from the right side. So for the colorwork pullovers, it would be better to knit them in a round, so there will be no working the colorwork from the wrong side, as it's quite a lot harder. But for designs such as cables or lace, I usually like knitting them flat, because for example, for lace, usually every second row is kind of a rest row. So every second row you will make the yarn overs and knit stitches together, and every second row you just knit the knit stitches and purl the purl stitches. So it's easier to remember which or what row you are on when you are knitting it from the front and from the back, so on the right side and on the wrong side. Also, the cables usually are knitted so that the cables happen on every uneven row, and the even rows are rest rows, so it's easier to keep track where you are when you are knitting it flat. I know many people don't like seaming, so they prefer knitting designs that are knitted flat, so there will be no seams. So when you are finished, no seams. However, seams do give structure and shape for the design. So if you want the design to be very flowy, then it shouldn't have many seams. But if you want more structure and like less stretching, and you want the design to keep their shape better, then I would suggest you to knit it flat and make seams. Or you can always make fake seams or basting if you want, but well, here's some little basics about that.